The reason that we talk about the digestive and respiratory systems right next to each other has to do with our friend aerobic cellular respiration. So we have a respiratory system essentially to bring oxygen in close contact with our cells and to get rid of carbon dioxide, which is a waste gas. And we eat in order for two basic reasons. One is to access the chemical bond energy in the food we eat, and the other is to break the food down and then generate the monomers that we can use to build up our own macromolecules. So that's sort of setting the stage there. So this week we're going to talk about the digestive system. This is kind of a silly cartoon, but it kind of has all of the relevant points. You can see mechanical digestion, which is the process of physically breaking food into smaller pieces, but not chemically altering it. And then chemical digestion, represented by the stomach dumping acid into the container. And the pancreas and the liver down here, adding in some additional emulsifiers and enzymes to help chemically break the food down. All right, so I used this video to sort of to kind of set the stage. Make sure it's not too loud.
And with her new teeth, she can take on more solid foods. Digestion starts in the mouth. Teeth grind up the food. Then special glands under the tongue pump out saliva to help break down and lubricate the food on its 12-hour, 13-foot journey through the gut. It'll pass from the stomach into the coils of the small intestine before finally passing into the large intestine. Waves of contracting muscle keep the food moving, a process called peristalsis. These contractions are so powerful, we can even eat upside down. For the first time, a new camera shows a high-definition view of how food travels through our bodies and into our stomachs. Food enters the stomach through a hole at the top. The stomach is a bag of muscle that churns, squashes, and squeezes food into liquid. At the same time, acids break the food down. The stomach walls protect themselves with a lining of mucus. Without it, the acids could digest parts of the stomach itself, causing stomach ulcers. About an hour later, the stomach squeezes the broken down food out through a tiny hole called the pyloric sphincter. The food enters the small intestine, an 11-foot coil of tube where we absorb most of the nutrients. The interior wall of the small intestine is lined with millions of microscopic projections called villi. These increase the surface area of the gut, making it easier to absorb nutrients. First, the pancreas pumps out its that neutralizes stomach acid. Then bile from the liver breaks down the fats into tiny droplets. Smaller droplets are easier for the intestine to absorb. After an hour and a half, the small intestine has absorbed most of the nutrients from the food. It's time for what remains to move on. It enters the large intestine through this, the ileocecal sphincter, a valve that keeps our food from going back where it came from. What's left is a mix of waste food and dead cells from the walls of the gut. The large intestine's main job is to extract water from it. Lots of bacteria live here too, but it isn't because of an infection. We actually need them. They produce enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates in our food, carbohydrates we couldn't otherwise digest. Finally, after about 12 hours, we expel what's left of our first meal.
So when you think about the digestive tract, one thing that's important to realize is that what you put in your mouth and the material that comes out of the anus are none of that material, if you're healthy, ever actually contacts the inside of your body. So that relates to this idea that we're donuts. We have a hole right through the middle. It's a twisty, turny hole, but it's a hole nonetheless. And the body has a lot of mechanisms for protecting itself from the outside world, right? We've got skin on the outside of our bodies, but all of the parts of our bodies that aren't directly exposed in the way that we think of being directly exposed to the outside world in terms of skin are coated with mucous membranes. And although mucuses can be a pain in the butt if you have a cold or if you have allergies, it's actually a really important part of protecting us from pathogens. So any place in the body that is sort of interior to the body, that's in contact with the outside world, the respiratory tract, digestive tract, the interior of the vagina, the lower urinary tract, all are lined with mucous membranes to protect the inside of our bodies from the outside world. This quote is just to make that point again. So you guys can read that at your leisure. Okay, so functions of the digestive system. Digestion, which includes the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food. And then once that's been done, absorption of nutrients. So we can't absorb macromolecules, right? There are a couple exceptions to that. You think about endocytosis of antibodies in breast milk, for example. And antibodies are large proteins. But in general, we don't and we can't absorb macromolecules. We absorb the monomers, the monosaccharides, amino acids, nucleotides, fatty acids, and glycerol that are the result of chemical digestion. Both of these processes digestion and absorption require that food is moved through different parts of this long digestive tract that we have, and that's referred to as propulsion. So we're actively moving material from one place to another. And each part of the digestive tract, the interior has certain specializations based on what's actually happening in that part of the digestive tract. The digestive system, most of it lies within what's referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity. The esophagus, which is the tube that material passes through from the mouth and the throat to the stomach, goes behind the pleural cavities that the lungs line in, and the pericardial cavity that the heart's in. all of the cavities that are completely within the body and are closed off from the outside world are lined with one kind or another of membrane. Most of those are serous membranes, and serous fluid is a very thin, lubricating fluid. We're not normally aware of the actual, all of the movements inside our bodies. Our lungs are constantly inflating and deflating, and the heart's beating, and the material is moving around in the digestive tract. Without the serous membranes that line the interior of these cavities that produce serous fluid, we'd essentially have a lot of, I don't know if stickiness is the right word, or friction burns, but there would be damage to our tissues because of the tissue rubbing against one layer rubbing against another. So the serous membrane that lines the abdominopelvic cavity is called the peritoneum. And some textbooks will call out the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, and that's what the person who made this illustration did. But there's actually no physical barrier between the abdominal and pelvic cavities. And that's a really important thing to remember as a clinician, because it determines, if you think about if someone has ovarian cancer or colon cancer, likely sites of metastasis are going to be within the abdominal pelvic cavity. The same thing is true if somebody has a pelvic infection that makes its way out of the uterus and into the fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes are open to the abdominopelvic cavity, so that can lead to a larger infection. I think the reason that, my understanding anyway, is that the reason that these two are sometimes called out separately is because surgeons need a way of describing where organs are located within this much larger cavity. So all of the thoracic cavity, which contains the cavities that the lungs are in and that the heart is in, and the abdominopelvic cavity are part of the larger ventral cavity in the body. And then the brain and the spinal cord are in the dorsal cavity. Okay, so we want you to know that alimentary, canal, and digestive tract refer to the same structure. So we have the upper digestive tract and the lower digestive tract. And then we have, but it's all part of the same continuous twisty-turny tube from mouth to anus. And then we have the accessory organs of digestion, the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. So we're going to first talk about the gastrointestinal or the digestive tract, and then we'll sort of pick up the accessory organs as we go along. So starting with the esophagus and all the way down through the anus, there are 4 layers that make up the wall of this tube that we call the digestive tract. The inside of the tube is called the lumen, which is where the French fries are in this image. And lumen is a general term for the hollow space inside, or the space inside a hollow organ. So arteries, veins, digestive tract, the windpipe, any sort of place in the body that material is moving through has something that we refer to as a lumen. So the innermost layer is called the mucosa, and that's the area, one of the areas that's most specialized in the digestive tract, depending on sort of which part of the tract you're in. Going out from there, we have the submucosa, which is where you find small embedded glands, as well as nerves and blood vessels. We have the muscularis layer, which is smooth muscle, and then the serosa, which is the serous membrane. All of these different serous membranes are essentially double layered. So the layer that is right against the organ is called the visceral whatever. This would be the visceral peritoneum. And the side, it's because viscera means organ. And then the side that's closest to the outside of the body, or the body wall, it would be the parietal peritoneum in this case. So if we look at the 2 inner layers, I think this is the image that I used for the concept check. So what we're looking at is, right, we've got the lumen here, you've got the mucosa, which does have depending on, again, which part of the tract, has scattered smooth muscle, but it's not the main muscle layer. So the mucosa is the innermost layer. It's where you have goblet cells, which are the ones that produce the mucus, digestive enzymes, if you're in a part of the tract where that's going on. The way this drawing is set up is sort of like some of the skeletal muscle diagrams we looked at last week, where you have, if you cut through the tract right through here, and then we pulled out the submucosa and then the mucosa, so that you can see what's happening in the different layers. So it's sort of supposed to give you a sense of three-dimensional nature. So the submucosa is made of loose connective tissue, and that's where you're going to find blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, and some additional glands. The 2 outer layers are the muscularis and then the serosa. So the muscularis layer has, at a minimum, 2 layers of smooth muscle that run at right angles to each other. So if we were gonna, let's see, let me do a drawing here, maybe, nope, darn it. Oh yeah, it will, woohoo, look at that. So the inner layer, the cells run around the tube, sort of like as a collar. And then the outer layer, they run longitudinally. And that particular anatomical arrangement is important for what's called peristalsis, which is the term for this synchronized movement of these 2 muscle layers that helps to move food through the tract. So for our our next practical exam, you definitely want to know those 4 layers. Again, the serosa, which in this case is going to be part of the peritoneum, that serous membrane, produces a thin lubricating fluid. In areas in the small intestine, the serosa is integrated with this larger structure that's called the mesentery that we'll talk about in a bit. So there are 5 main steps to digestion. Ingestion, which is the intake of food. The 2 different kinds of digestion, which is breaking the food into pieces, right? Mechanical digestion, you're simply grinding the food into smaller pieces. Not that it's simple, but I say that because you're not going from polymer to monomer, which is what chemical digestion is. So chemical digestion is absolutely necessary in order for the 4th process, which is absorption, to occur. Once the macromolecules in our food have been broken down into monomers, then absorption can occur, because we can only absorb the monomers, and we don't generally call them monomers at that point. We call them nutrients, because it's a more it's a friendlier term. And then that absorption is across the wall from the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract, particularly, and this happens mainly in small intestine, into the blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels of the small intestine. And then the cardiovascular system can deliver that material. And then finally, material that's not digested, dead bacteria. We shed the lining of the digestive tract not quite as fast as we do our outer covering, our skin, but that's also part of what you find in feces. Okay, so I'm good, thanks, hon. So digestion involves movement through the digestive tract, and there are 2 kinds of movement that we want you guys to be familiar with in this course. First is swallowing, and then peristalsis. So just as a broad overview, right, this material goes from the mouth to what is referred to as the pharynx. That's the technical name for the throat, to the esophagus, to the stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine, and then to the rectum and the anus. This is a really good summary slide, because in terms of not just learning the path that material takes, but also you've got all of the accessory organs in there. The one caveat is, with respect to this, is that the liver is actually it's turned upward so that you can see the gallbladder underneath. Okay, so the mouth. We've got the hard palate and the soft palate. The difference is that the hard palate is where you have the palatine bone, which forms the roof of the mouth. The soft palate is an extension of that, made of connective tissue and lined with, again, with mucous membrane. The uvula is part of the soft palate, and it is sort of what you see if you open your mouth and when you look in the mirror. Because one of the functions of the uvula when we swallow is that it flips up and reflexively flips up and covers the opening to the nasal cavity. Because, as you're probably aware, the nasal cavity goes into the throat or the pharynx, and so does the mouth. We have a tongue that's involved in mechanical digestion and moving food around within the mouth. It also has sensory organs called taste buds that allow us to assess the what we think of as, you know, palatability, or how good our food tastes, is actually a way of detecting whether the food is spoiled or not, or whether it's potentially poisonous or not. Now, it's obviously, there are plenty of things that are poisonous and taste good. Kids are fond of lead paint because lead has a sweet taste to it. So when they're young, if they're in a house that has lead paint on the windowsills or something, and they're teething, they like to chew on that, unfortunately. Okay, so the tongue, along with the teeth, is involved in mechanical digestion, and the product of mechanical digestion in the mouth is referred to as a bolus. And swallowing involves the tongue moving the food to the back of the throat in this coordinated activity. And then, right, swallowing, the initial phases of swallowing are voluntary, but it becomes involuntary once you get back to the area where, in the back of the throat, where the reflex is triggered. So we've got teeth, and the enamel on teeth is the hardest substance in our bodies. We have two sets of teeth when we're born, although the second set isn't fully developed. If you want to get really scared, look at an X-ray of a young child from the side, or actually even from the front of the head, because their teeth, the second layer of teeth, is all lined up waiting. It's very creepy looking. The technical name for chewing is mastication, and the masseter muscle, which you guys learned about, is one of the main muscles involved in mastication. So chewing is mechanical digestion. Our mouths are the interior of our mouths, right? We've got mucous membrane. We have salivary glands that help with the three major ones that are considered accessory organs of digestion, produce enzymes in the saliva. But there are also smaller ones all over the interior of the mouth that just keep our mouths slightly wet, and that is important for keeping the level of harmful bacteria down. All of us, our mouths are coated with a layer of bacteria, regardless of how much you brush your teeth or how much mouthwash you use. And they're actually, one of the factors for your likelihood of getting cavities or dental caries is whether or not you're, what kinds of bacteria you have in your mouth. If you have the healthy kind, right, it's sort of like having a really healthy lawn where the grass is really thick, and it essentially shades out weed seeds so they can't take hold. Same thing's true if you have the right kind of bacteria in your mouth. They outcompete the kind that lead to cavities. Okay, so first, accessory organs are the salivary glands. So there are the three pairs that produce enzymes involved in digestion are the parotid gland, which is ginormous and sort of extends from about where the curve of your ear begins, down to where the curve of your mandible is, and then it is connected with a long duct into the back of the mouth, the submandibular gland, which is right under the mandible on either side, and then the sublingual glands, which are under the tongue. Lingua means tongue, so it literally means under the tongue gland. Saliva is a really complex cocktail of molecules. So there's mucus, it's water-based, obviously, and there are additional enzymes. Well, let me back up. So remember from biochemistry, enzymes are proteins that facilitate chemical reactions. And in the case of digestion, we're really talking about enzymes that aid in hydrolysis reactions. So they're helping to break macromolecules down into smaller macromolecules until eventually we get to monomers. So the salivary glands secrete salivary amylase, and amylase is an enzyme that digests amylose, which is one of the names for starch. So when you see at the end of a word, or at the end of a molecule, OSE, that means it's a carbohydrate. If you see ASE, it means it's an enzyme. So chemical digestion of carbohydrates starts in the mouth with salivary amylase, and the salivary glands also produce salivary lipase, which, given what I just told you, right, you've got the ASE for enzyme and the lip for lipid. So chemical digestion of lipids. Some people say it starts in the mouth. The salivary lipase has more activity in the stomach, but it's made by the salivary glands. All right, so then we have the pharynx, which is a really anatomically complex structure. So that's highlighted in blue here. The images that have the turquoise highlights are from the anatomy and physiology version of Visible Body. I bought it a while ago just because I thought it was so darn fantastic to take screenshots from. And then we got the anatomy atlas. So if it looks familiar, that's why. So the pharynx, or the throat, is anatomically really complex. And it leads to both the esophagus, which is highlighted here, and the trachea, which has been hidden here. So the trachea would be right around where my cursor would come off, right around where my cursor is. So that obviously poses a little bit of a problem, because we have a common entryway for food and for air, and we don't want those getting mixed up. So there's a specialized flap of cartilage called the epiglottis, which protects the windpipe or the trachea from the entry of food. So then we've got the esophagus. Its main job is to get food from the pharynx to the stomach. It's pretty much just a passageway. So we look at a mid-sagittal section of the head. And you can see all those brain structures you guys know now, and the bones, the nasal bone. There's the sphenoid right here, the frontal bone. The pharynx has 3 areas. It's all continuous, right? But you have the nasopharynx, which is at the top of the throat. The oropharynx, which is right behind the tongue, which is this entire structure is the tongue. And then the laryngopharynx, which is right around the epiglottis. So the esophagus is in the back here. And the esophagus is collapsed unless there's food moving through it. Whereas the the larynx, and which is the voice box, the glottis is the opening in the voice box that air passes through that allows us to make sound. So the epiglottis during the reflexive part of swallowing flips down and covers the opening to the larynx to prevent food from entering the lungs. And that's really important because unlike the digestive tract, which is a tube that runs from one part of the body to the other, the lungs, you've got a way in, but there's no way out. There's no sort of, there's no exit unless we're talking about air. And then we've got the uvula here. So you can sort of see why if the uvula doesn't flip up during the reflexive part of swallowing, you can end up with stuff coming out your nose. What else did I want to say about this one? Oh, this is this hollow place is the sphenoid sinus, and this is the frontal sinus. And this is the one that always gets me when I have a migraine. Actually, they both kind of get me. All right, so the way this little video is going to show us the mechanism of swallowing and then peristalsis, which leads into the stomach. And actually, peristalsis is the general term we use for coordinated activity of smooth muscle. So there's peristalsis in our ureters to get urine from the kidneys to the bladder.
Swallowing occurs in two stages, the oropharyngeal and esophageal stages. At the start of a swallow, a food bolus is voluntarily pressed by the tongue up against the roof of the mouth and backwards towards the pharynx. In response to activation of pharyngeal pressure receptors, the swallowing center in the medulla initiates reflexes that prevent food entry into respiratory passageways. The uvula contracts, which blocks the nasal passages from the pharynx. The laryngeal muscles contract, closing the glottis at the top of the trachea by tightly aligning the vocal folds. The epiglottis swings down upon the closed glottis. With all airways blocked off, respiration is temporarily inhibited. As the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, pharyngeal contractions drive the bolus into the esophagus. The oropharyngeal stage is done and breathing resumes. During the esophageal stage, a primary wave of peristalsis initiated by the swallowing center pushes the bolus through the esophagus. As the bolus travels through the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes, allowing the food to enter the stomach. If the bolus is sticky and adheres to the esophagus, secondary peristaltic waves triggered by the intrinsic plexus at the point of distension completely clear the esophageal lumen to finish the swallow.
So the business about intrinsic plexus, one of the things that we don't talk about with the nervous system, and that hopefully you'll hear about in Anat and Phys, is that there's actually a third nervous system called the enteric nervous system. Sometimes people describe it as, another brain associated with our digestive tract. The enteric nervous system, you actually have sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. So it's, contrary to what we typically say, where the only place you have interneurons is in the central nervous system. In the enteric nervous system, it's a really specialized branch of the nervous system. So eventually, my guess is you'll learn there are three branches of the nervous system: central, peripheral, and the enteric nervous system. The organization is a little different, and I think that's why we don't talk about it. So, two phases to swallowing: voluntary and involuntary. So, in the voluntary phase, the esophagus is closed, the trachea or the airway is open. The tongue, I mean, we don't really think about it, but you have to decide to swallow. We just we just don't normally decide. We just normally kind of eat and we don't think about it. But it is actually voluntary. The involuntary phase, as they said in the video, is triggered when you have the pressure receptors in the soft palate or the back of the mouth are activated. And that leads to the opening of the upper gastroesophageal sphincter up here, the flipping up of the uvula, just this red arrow, and then the flipping down of the epiglottis to cover the glottis, which is right where my cursor is. And then that leads to the movement of food, of the bolus, into the esophagus and onto the stomach. So again, peristalsis is the name for these coordinated movements of smooth muscle. And remember, both smooth and cardiac muscle are involuntary. And this line for upper gastroesophageal sphincter doesn't really, well, I guess that could be considered part of it, because a sphincter is sphincter just means circular muscle. And there are sphincters all over the body, and they all sort of look kind of the same when you look at them from inside. Okay, so functions of the stomach. Here's the strange thing. The stomach is technically a bladder. Bladders are things that store food, that store materials. Obviously, the urinary bladder does not store food. So the stomach has anatomical specializations that allow it to expand. And in part, that's a holdover from our evolutionary history. Food was hard to come by, and so when you found food as an early human or pre-human, you gorged on it, and that meant you needed a place to. You wanted to eat as much as you possibly could in case you didn't come across food again for a while. So the particular anatomical feature that I'm going to show you is called, they're called rugae, which is Latin for ridges. Second function is to begin the digestion of proteins. So protein digestion starts in the stomach. Lipid digestion is going to continue there because of the salivary lipase. One of the things I can't believe I didn't put this in here, but you should write this down. Mechanical digestion. So when we talk about, let's see if I can make this work. So chemical digestion of proteins. But in general, the food is incredibly muscular. Mechanical digestion. Unlike other parts of the digestive tract, The stomach actually has 3 layers of smooth muscle, as befits its grinding capacity. So chemical digestion. The product of stomach movement, stomach motility, as well as the, so the churning of the stomach leads to mixing of the, not sure what the plural of bolus is, boli, boluses of food into this pasty substance referred to as chyme. And chyme is the boluses mixed with what's referred to as gastric juice. So the stomach is described as being J-shaped, having a J shape. You've got the lower gastroesophageal or cardiac sphincter up in here. The pyloric sphincter, which controls movement of material into the small intestine right here. And you can see in this little call out 3 different layers of muscle that run at different angles to one another. So you can see the rugae, or the ridges on the interior of the stomach. And as you put food into the stomach, it's capable essentially of inflating. So imagine, if you look at a balloon that has been blown up repeatedly and then the air is let out, you can kind of see those ridges. It's the same kind of thing. So the addition of that extra layer of muscle, so you have longitudinal and transverse muscle layers, so those would be these 2, and you also have an oblique layer. Oblique means slanted. So you've got the fact that, and remember, muscle cells produce force, and so movement by shortening, the fact they're going to be shortening in different directions, and that's how you get this more complicated movement. And it also allows for additional stretching. Like, think about fabric that is, it's just woven like this. You're going to have not as much stretch as if you have another layer woven in. Also, you have to have the right kind of thread, but okay. So if we look stomach, right, and then we look at the layers, right? I'm showing you this not because you need to memorize tons of details about what this organ looks like on the tissue layer level, but to show you this, to make this broader point as we go through the lecture about specialization of the tract in different places, but you still have the same 4 layers. So you have the mucosal layer, the submucosa, you can see the blood vessels here, the muscularis layer, and we've got 1, 2, 3 layers of muscle, and then the serosa here. So if I look, this is a view from an endoscope of the stomach without any food in it, because it's just seeing the rugae in this type of view compared to seeing it in a drawing, I think is, to me, this is kind of unforgettable. It looks almost like a brain that's been turned partially inside out or something. So the rugae are what allows the stomach to expand, because, and again, whenever you see folds in a biological structure, you want to think, I wonder if that's to increase surface area, right? In this case, it's not about absorption, because there's very little is actually absorbed in the stomach. In fact, no nutrients are absorbed in the stomach. Certain drug molecules, certain vitamins, which are considered nutrients because they're not used to build macromolecules, and alcohol, which obviously is a drug. So, when people drink on an empty stomach, if alcohol is absorbed in your stomach and there's nothing to keep the alcohol from coming into contact with the lining of the stomach, you're going to absorb the alcohol much more rapidly. Okay, so this is another drawing of the interior of the stomach, and this is just showing us again those same 4 layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. And it also has a little call out of what are called gastric pits. So gastric, the prefix gastro means stomach. So gastroesophageal sphincter is the sphincter between the stomach and the esophagus. And gastric pits are going to be in the stomach. Gastric juice is the juice in the stomach. These pits are, gastric pits are complex structures, and you have different cells in here that do different things. That's a really dumb way of saying it. But you don't, I altered this figure to take out the names of the cells because you really don't need to know that at this point. So there are some cells that make hydrochloric acid, which is stomach acid. There are cells that are called goblet cells that produce mucus, and the stomach has a very thick layer of mucus to protect itself from its own acid. There are other cells that create an enzyme, a pre-enzyme called pepsinogen, which I'll talk about more in a second. And then there are also cells that secrete hormones. And we don't really talk much about sort of either the nervous or hormonal control of digestion in this course, but when you get to AP2, you'll learn a lot more about that. It's a really active area of research because it seems as though so many of us have dysregulated digestive systems. Okay, so gastric juice. Mucus, HCl, which is hydrochloric acid, 1 hydrogen, 1 chlorine, and then this enzyme or pre-enzyme called pepsinogen. So when you, that prefix pep, think peptide. Peptide bonds are the bonds formed during dehydration synthesis of proteins. And in general, that is going to be the PEP is going to be a cue to you that we're talking about something that has to do with proteins. When you have pepsinogen, and you have a really low pH, which we have in the stomach because of the hydrochloric acid, the pepsinogen is activated and converted into pepsin. And that's the enzyme that begins hydrolysis of proteins into smaller bits. So you don't go from myosin and actin in a cow muscle, for example, because you ate a cheeseburger, in one step. You break off, first you break that big myosin into smaller bits that are called peptides, and then eventually in the small intestine, those are going to be broken into amino acids. So The hydrochloric acid in the stomach activates the pepsinogen, and the gen means generate, so it generates pepsin in the right conditions. But it also has the secondary, really important function, which is that most bacteria in our food can't, and most viruses that are associated with food that might be able to infect our cells can't survive that really acidic pH. And then finally, we have the mucus that's produced, protects the stomach from its own hydrochloric acid, and it's also a barrier to infection. We produce gastric juice continuously, but there are all kinds of variables that push that production around. So your nervous system, your endocrine system, what you are eating currently, what you typically eat, all of those things contribute to regulating gastric juice. Okay, so as I said before, the stomach doesn't absorb much, but it does absorb alcohol. Oh, and caffeine, which is why I always have my coffee on an empty stomach. Actually, I should start drinking it black instead of putting half and half and sugar in it. But then I miss the rest of my breakfast, you know. Coffee sweet and light is a complete food, if you're me. Okay, stomach emptying. So when food moves into the stomach, the lower gastroesophageal sphincter obviously has to be open, but the pyloric sphincter at the other end of the stomach needs to be closed. And as the stomach is churning, both sphincters need to be closed, right? You're going to get reflux of stomach acid into the esophagus and have pain if the lower gastroesophageal sphincter doesn't close completely. Stomach emptying is gradual in order for two reasons. One, right, so we say, so high acidity doesn't burn the small intestine. And that's true, right? The small intestine does not produce the same sort of thick mucus coat that the stomach does. So if you emptied the stomach completely all at once, you would burn the crap out of yourself. But even more important from an evolutionary perspective is that the enzymes that in the small intestine all require a pH of about 8 in order to be active, right? So they would be completely denatured if you dumped a load of acidic chyme all at once into them. So there's another little video. I don't think this one they say anything. So stomach ulcers are not caused by stress. They're caused by a bacterial infection with Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori. If you end up with a stomach ulcer, a really severe one, the H. pylori manage to eat their way through all 4 layers of the stomach, you end up with what's called a bleeding ulcer, and that's a medical emergency because, as they show in this little animation, you actually can bleed out internally. The digestive tract is really heavily vascularized, and if you are dumping a whole bunch of acidic material into the abdominopelvic cavity, there's going to be trouble. You're going to have a lot of tissue damage and you're going to break blood vessels. The other thing I just want to point out to you guys, right, so we've got the sternum here, the costal cartilage associated with the ribs. And then this is the diaphragm, which is the major muscle of respiration, the liver there. So heartburn is acid reflux. So normally that sphincter closes completely. And so when the stomach churns, the stomach acid can't pop back up and damage the lining of the esophagus. Sometimes people have a sphincter that doesn't work as well, just genetically, for genetic reasons. Other times it's a result of changes in coordination of those smooth muscles. Other times, well, when it happens in infants, it's a really common reason for colic in babies. Colic just means that kids cry unconsolably and you can't soothe them. And, you know, so people always used to say their nervous system just isn't mature enough yet. They'll grow out of it. And while that may be true in some cases, for some kids, they come into the world with the lower gastroesophageal sphincter not being completely functional. So they have acid reflux. And what do babies do when they're in pain? They scream and they cry. And they get fussier after they eat. So I tell that story sort of as a cautionary tale. That was true of my son, who was really, really tough as a baby. And you know, you take them to the doctor, the pediatrician, they're like, he's fine, he's just colicky, he's gaining weight, everything's fine. And finally ended up, after 3 months of this, you know, poor kid screaming himself for felt like 24 hours a day, he stopped gaining weight, and they did a barium series. So you had to drink a little bottle of barium. And sure enough, his poor little esophagus was all eroded from stomach acid. So
I know with my daughter, when I would feed her when she was a baby,
yeah,
and you know, give her a bottle, you burp her, she burps, and then a few minutes later, it's like a waterfall.
mm-hmm.
She
Yeah,
always did that.
yeah. And some kids actually have immature pyloric sphincters. So, and in that case, I mean, obviously, if you get this acidic chyme in the small intestine, that's going to cause pain. But it's more common for the pyloric sphincter to not respond to nerve impulses and to just not open. And those kids have projectile vomiting, which is a thing in and of itself. I've only experienced that once with my kids and never with myself. But my son had a really bad stomach bug. He was a toddler. He just opened his mouth and it shot straight, his vomit shot straight out. I've never seen anything like it. It was like I was in The Exorcist all of a sudden. But that can be life-threatening because they can't, almost all nutrient absorption happens in the small intestine. And if material is not getting into the small intestine in sufficient amounts, they're essentially going to starve no matter how much you feed them. So it has to be corrected and fast. So gastric bypass is the single most effective way of treating serious long-term obesity, and it involves, there are a number of different procedures, but the one that's the most effective and has the lowest complication rate is a true gastric bypass. And it's not so much that you bypass the stomach, but what you do is you don't remove the stomach. You essentially wall off most of the stomach, and then attach the small intestine to this small pouch that's left. Right, the stomach can expand, right, and when you eat a lot, and this is certainly true whether you eat a lot or not, your stomach is going to expand. One of the problems not for people who are considered obese, but I'm thinking of the folks that are competitive eaters, that, how many hot dogs can you eat in however amount of time? They often end up with really serious digestive troubles because their stomachs, they essentially train their stomachs to stretch far more than they should. And occasionally, you can make your stomach burst. So this little video just sort of shows the gastric bypass. So this is what's left of the stomach. Oops, shoot, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stop it here. There we go. So as is often the case, if you can avoid taking an organ out of the body, you do. So the stomach isn't actually removed. Remember, the digestive tract has lots and lots of blood vessels. It's really vascular. So this is sutured and closed or cauterized. The end is sewn into the intestine, and this first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, is where where bile is introduced, which is important for mechanically breaking fats down. It's also where all of the pancreatic juice that contains the majority of digestive enzymes gets ported into the system. So you leave it there for lots of reasons, including you don't want to have all that bleeding. Part of what's referred to as satiety, which is that sensation of feeling like you've eaten enough, has to do with stomach stretching. So the nerves that are associated with this part of the stomach are going to atrophy. So they're going to become less active. And the nerves with this part are going to be more stimulated. That in turn leads to the production of different kinds of hormones, and it seems to reset the whole system in ways that people don't fully understand yet. It can reverse type 2 diabetes in short order, even before people lose significant amounts of weight. So it's one of those operations that is, people used to really look down on it, I think, sort of in popular culture, because there was this idea that, these people who are overweight just don't have enough willpower, which is just a bunch of crap. Being obese is not about willpower. It's about genes and environment. And yes, some people can work their way to losing weight and keep it off for long periods of time, but most people can't, in the same way that most alcoholics relapse. You know, it's not as simple as willpower. Okay, small intestine starts at the pyloric sphincter, which isn't in this image, so the stomach would be up here. There are 3 sections: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The ileum is right around the iliac crest of the coxal bone, so that's one way to remember that. And the interior of the small intestine is specialized for absorption. So you have specialized cells within the small intestine, especially in the duodenum, that produce digestive enzymes. It's also, the duodenum's also where the pancreatic juice is introduced. And pancreatic juice has tons of different enzymes. Remember, each enzyme is specialized for a particular substrate. So if we have sucrose, right, which is table sugar, the enzyme that breaks that down is sucrase. There's another 2-monomer sugar called lactose. It's broken down by an enzyme called lactase. So there are, because each enzyme is specific to a particular set of substrate, we have a wealth of different enzymes. And our food contains all 4 macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and I should have said lipids rather than fats there. Lipids are hard to digest, and well, they're hard to transport, right, because they're nonpolar. And digestive juices are based on water. Water and lipids don't mix. So part of the way that you make lipids more available for chemical digestion is with a substance called bile. Bile is made by the liver, but it's stored in the gallbladder. And it emulsifies fats, and I'll talk more about emulsification in a second.
Okay, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have my gallbladder.
Me neither.
And I was told, I heard that you cannot absorb vitamin D because you don't have a gallbladder.
No.
And the only way you can get the vitamin D is going out into the sun.
Well, being in the sun is the most effective way to make vitamin D. Vitamin D is just hard to absorb from the
So
digestion.
my doctor puts me on a vitamin D vitamin, and I'm like, why, when it can't be absorbed in the body because I have no gallbladder?
Yeah, it can actually be absorbed. Because vitamin D is a steroid, so it's not like, you know, a big old lipid, you know, that's coming from butter or from fat from a steak or a cheeseburger, or from cheese for that matter. If that was the case, people wouldn't, like, they'd be much more careful about taking out the gallbladder. But well, I'll explain more about that in a second. So in adults, your small intestine is about 18 feet long. So it is very long, but much narrower than the large intestine, which is maybe 5-6 feet 4 to 6 feet. But the large intestine, at least the colon part of the large intestine, is much wider in diameter, a much larger lumen. Okay, so more about the small intestine. The small intestine has these small finger-like projections that are called villi. And these are projections into the lumen of the small intestine. This is an image sort of looking down on the top of a bunch of villi, and then this is a side view. And it starts to show you sort of what is inside each villus. So the plural is villi, the singular is villus. So if we look again at the layers of the small, or the layers of the digestive tract, right? We've got the serosa, we've got the sclera's layers, the submucosa, and then the mucosa. And then we have a little call out here that's got 2 villi. A couple things I want to mention. So you have villi, right? Each villus is made of hundreds of cells, and which is increasing surface area, right, with these folds. The small intestine also has circular folds that sort of that run around, which is another way of increasing surface area. If you look inside a single villus, what you see is you've got, right, if the lumen is out here, this is where the digested food is and where digestion is actually happening. We absorb materials across the wall of the small intestine. So the nutrients have to be transported either passively or actively with molecular pumps, depending, into the area where you have this capillary bed. Now, you can only absorb into the bloodstream molecules that are polar or partially polar. So amino acids and monosaccharides can go directly into the bloodstream, right? In order for us to absorb lipids, we have to consider these small lymphatic capillaries that are called lacteals. So sort of in the middle of each of these little capillary beds, you have a lacteal, and the lacteals absorb lipids. This is just showing, if you look at an intestinal, oh no, it's not an intestinal crypt, one of the cells in the small intestine. So we've got one full cell here and then 2 partials. Even the cells have these specializations on the what's called the apical surface, or the surface facing the inside of the small intestine. So that's the third level of folding that you have that increases ability to absorb materials. Okay, so if you think, let me go back for just a second. If you think about the small intestine here, right, it's really long and narrow, and the consequences of this long, narrow tube getting twisted are catastrophic. I mean, that's an intestinal blockage. Again, that's a medical emergency. It tends not to happen because we have this structure called the mesentery. So the mesentery is, well, it's now considered an organ. lots of connective tissue. People used to think of it as, okay, this is the thing that works the small intestine, that keeps the keeps it from twisting, right? And especially for animals like ourselves that walk on 2 feet, if you think about, think about a dog, for example, right? Their intestine, their small intestine, is being pulled downward by gravity. So you couldn't see my stomach anyway, probably. So there's not the same sort of issue with gravity potentially contributing to things getting twisted up. It turns out that the mesentery isn't just a way of organizing the small intestine, though, but it also has immune function. It is shot through with lymphatic vessels, obviously, because you've got to get the lipids from the lacteals into the bloodstream eventually, right? And that's going to happen with the lymphatic system, which is this whole other set of vessels right above the heart. All of the lymph will get dumped back into the cardiovascular system. Not all of it, but much of it. It's also richly innervated by the nerves of the enteric nervous system, but also the autonomic nervous system as well. And lots of blood vessels, because the small intestine is where we absorb nutrients by and large. So this is, again, just to try and, you can tell in the past students have not paid enough attention to the layers of the intestinal tract, as I just keep adding more pictures. So the lumen, right, this is a cross section through small intestine. The lumen, the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis layers, and the serosa. And the serosa is continuous with the mesentery. Okay, so carbohydrate digestion and transport. So we've got salivary amylase, right? I said carbohydrate digestion starts in the mouth. The pancreas also produces amylase, and the pancreas, we'll talk more about in a minute. It sits behind and under the stomach, and this little organ over here is a bit of spleen. Pancreatic amylase secretes a whole bunch of, or pancreatic amylase and the other hormones. Come on, Cindy, not hormones. The other enzymes created by the pancreas, sucrase, lactase, maltase, which break down sucrose, lactose, maltose, are ported into the lumen of the small intestine. And this is showing us a piece in probably the jejunum or the ileum, but pancreatic amylase would be, the pancreatic juice is going to be introduced in the duodenum. And then this is just showing you that if there's excess monosaccharide, all blood in the digestive tract flows through the liver before it enters circulation, which does three things. It allows, let's say 3 things. It allows the liver to pull monosaccharides out of circulation if blood sugar is high enough, or if it's too high. So it's a way of sort of helping to control blood sugar. There are a lot of resident immune system cells there that are going to check to see if any pathogens have made it thus far. And then there are also what's the third thing I was going to say? Oh, it's our detox organ. So any toxins that we might have ingested with our food, and we ingest a lot of toxins, not because we're eating food laden with pesticides necessarily. Well, we are, but they're natural, right? Caffeine is a pesticide that plants produce. Nicotine is a pesticide that plants produce. There is a whole bunch of them, because plants are living things that protect themselves from predators, meaning anyone who would like to eat them, by producing molecules that make animals sick or feel unwell. So carbohydrate digestion starts in the mouth, finishes in the small intestine, and all of the absorption is in the small intestine. Oops, wrong way. Protein digestion starts in the stomach, right, where we've got pepsin or pepsinogen made into pepsin, that, and the muscular contractions of the stomach, the peristalsis of the stomach, helps to really mix gastric juice with the contents of the stomach. Mechanical digestion of protein of all food starts in the mouth, right, because you're chewing. Chemical digestion of protein starts in the stomach, ends in the small intestine, because that's where absorption happens, right? All chemical digestion is finished by the small intestine, by the end of the small intestine. Okay, so lipid digestion and transportation. So we've got salivary lipase, that in the context of stomach acids helps to break larger fats into smaller ones, and helps to physically separate, well, in part the acid does that. When you get to the small intestine, where you have bile, and which is not an enzyme, right? Bile is an emulsifier, but there are enzymes produced by the pancreas. The one we want you guys to remember is pancreatic lipase, that do hydrolysis of lipids. So more about bile. So, right, lipids are nonpolar. Oil and water don't mix, right? If you add an emulsifier, something that is capable of, it's essentially, sort of, in a way, kind of like a phospholipid. It's got, and it's able to hold on to water and to a nonpolar substance. You have an emulsifier, right? And that gives the appearance of, well, it actually does kind of allow for a lipid to dissolve somewhat in water, or to say suspended in water. And by doing that, by contributing to this emulsification, what bile does is increase the surface area that the pancreatic lipase has to actually get at the lipid. So lipids are absorbed, as I said before, they're absorbed in a different way. They actually are transported into the epithelial cells. So all mucous membranes are epithelial, and that the vesicle is ported to and then moves through the Golgi body before it comes out the other side of the absorptive epithelial cell. So in here we've got a little tissue fluid, we've got a capillary, right? It's just not going through the capillary, by the way. It's going sort of around it. And then lymphatic capillaries, unlike capillaries in the cardiovascular system, are quite leaky. They have these sort of openings between certain of the cells, and that allows for the transportation of these vesicles into the lacteal. We're going to focus mainly on the accessory organs associated with the small intestine here, liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. But don't forget the salivary glands are accessory organs as well. So here's the liver. It's ginormous. I think it's the largest organ we have next to skin. It sits right under the diaphragm. It's, you know, if you open the abdominopelvic cavity, it's the first thing you're going to see. And if we were on campus and we were doing our rat dissection, people are always amazed at how large the liver is. It's especially large in rats because they tend to eat, at least city rats eat a lot of garbage, and so they need a lot of detox. The liver has more functions than I can count, really, but there are 6 that we would like you guys to remember. The first has to do with what's referred to as the hepatic portal system. HEPA means liver, so hepatitis is a liver disease. The hepatic portal system is a system of blood vessels that carries blood from, you can see the stomach, part of the stomach here, the part of the small intestine, the large intestine. All of that blood, the venous blood, goes through this portal system into the liver before it enters circulation, right? And again, that's an adaptation for sort of checking the blood out before it goes into circulation. So if you have a healthy liver and healthy kidneys, that's any money you spend on stuff that people say, well, is you need for detox. Unless, I mean, I'm not talking about detoxing from drugs, that's different. But like, you know, all of the stuff at the health food store where they're saying this will detoxify you, or put this on your skin to detoxify you. It's just it's a money-making gimmick. I'm sure some people who sell that stuff believe it, but it doesn't do anything. Your liver is what does the work. The liver also stores fat-soluble vitamins, and I think B12 is water-soluble as well. And it stores iron, right? It's very, very vascular, which is why it's always shown as red in images. It's also one of the places that is important for breaking down the protein from red blood cells called hemoglobin and helping to recycle it. We'll talk a lot more about that when we do, actually next week when we talk about blood and the respiratory system. In this image, we've got our 2 detox organs, well, our 3 if you have 2 kidneys. So we've got 2 kidneys, and then the liver is in light pink here, and that's the base of the heart. The liver can store monosaccharides as glycogen, and when our blood sugar gets low, it responds to a hormone that the pancreas produces called glucagon that is a signal to break glycogen into glucose. That creates a pool of free glucose that then goes down, or goes with its concentration gradient out of the liver and into the bloodstream, and then your blood sugar goes back up. The plasma proteins that we're going to talk about next week, those are made in the liver. Cholesterol, most of the cholesterol in your body is actually made in your liver. People who have high cholesterol, particularly folks that have high cholesterol when they're younger, it's usually because they have a genetic variant that means they just produce a lot of cholesterol. It doesn't mean just because their genes are doing it doesn't mean it's a safe thing. So those folks tend to be, they have good doctors are put on statins early in life to help control their cholesterol levels, because although we need it because it's the parent for all steroid hormones and you need it for cell membranes, too much can lead to the buildup of plaques in our arteries and all kinds of problems. Last but not least, the liver makes bile salts, and that's what is used to emulsify fats. So the liver makes bile. Oh, I forgot. Liver disorders. Look at that ugly, ugly cirrhotic liver. Cirrhosis is essentially scarring of the liver, where you have connective tissue. Scarring is, or fibrosis, is fibrous connective tissue produced that eventually you have more fibrotic or fibrous connective tissue produced in response to damage to the liver. And then if you damage your liver faster than your liver can regenerate itself, then you can end up with liver failure. The liver's one of the few organs we have that actually not only can it repair itself, unlike anything else that I know of other than skin, but you can also donate a lobe of your liver, and yours will grow back, and that lobe will grow in someone. You can be a living donor. Hepatitis, remember hepa, you should think liver. Itis means inflammation, so hepatitis is inflammation of the liver, and that's caused by, actually, as I said, 3 related viruses. Hepatitis A, B, and C are 3 different viruses. Hepatitis D and E can only infect liver cells, which are called hepatocytes, because liver and cell. If I think D can only infect cells if you also have cells infected with hepatitis B, and I think C and A can co-infect. Viruses are tough because they're not alive, so you can't kill them, right? Like you can't. Antibiotics are literally anti-life. And different antibiotics target different things about bacteria, but they're completely ineffective against viruses. And by and large, what we have to offer people who have serious viral illness is supportive care. That's changed in the last couple decades. We have medications for HIV that can, cure is way too strong a word, but they can suppress the ability of the virus to replicate enough that people, when I'm old enough, like that I went to college pre-HIV, was just coming on the scene when I graduated college. And it was a death sentence when people were diagnosed. They made their will, and prepared themselves. And that's just, it's treated much more like a chronic disease now. Hepatitis, particularly hepatitis C, which is the most serious version, can lead to liver cancer and death. And usually hepatitis C is asymptomatic until it's fairly advanced. So it was really, you know, it was one of those things, one of the viral illnesses that wasn't screened for at all, because if you can't do anything about it, you really do a disservice by testing. You do a disservice to the healthcare system as well as to individuals by telling them they have an incurable disease and then, okay, just go on about your life. Because a lot of people, as you can imagine, that generates a lot of anxiety. But at this point, we can actually cure hepatitis C. That too has just happened in the last couple years. And initially it was ridiculously expensive. Now, I think it was probably priced appropriately. I think it was about $250,000 for 12 weeks, and that was curative. But $250,000 is a lot less than a liver transplant and treatment for liver cancer. So the cost, now that there are additional companies that have developed similar meds, has come down quite a bit. Okay, gallbladder. It's a bladder. It stores bile. So when you produce a lot of bile, it comes down through the common hepatic duct, and it's very sludgy. Some of it will back up into the gallbladder. And then we've got the common bile duct. The gallbladder will absorb some of the water from bile, and if it absorbs too much, that's when you get gallstones. It releases it. There's smooth muscle associated with it, and it will release bile into the common bile duct in response to eating a fatty meal. Over here, we've got the pancreas, which is described as being fish-shaped, but doesn't look very fishy to me. Is both an endocrine and an exocrine organ. So exocrine glands produce molecules and then push them out into ducts, and then the duct carries the molecule to someplace else. In this case, to this common opening into the duodenum. The pancreas also has an endocrine function by producing insulin and glucagon, and an endocrine gland secretes material directly into the bloodstream. So the pancreas makes pancreatic juice that contains enzymes that break down all kinds of macromolecules, including if you eat an apple, you're eating apple DNA. Same thing with a burger. And your system will break those DNA down and RNA down into nucleotides. One other really important function for the pancreas is it produces a molecule called bicarbonate, which is basic. So stomach acid, as it moves slowly into the small intestine, is neutralized and made slightly basic by the addition of bicarbonate from the pancreas. And then we've got the insulin function. So this is going to show us type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes, let me stop this right here. So this is showing us sort of the normal thing that happens. So this is a cell in the small intestine. This is the lumen of the small intestine. You've got insulin receptors, which are the yellow, insulin, which is the red. And the insulin receptor is part of, it's a ligand-gated channel, similar to a neurotransmitter channel, but what is allowed to flow through it is glucose. So when you're healthy, when the system's functioning normally, the insulin binds to the receptor actually moves over to the channel and causes it to change shape, and glucose can flow into your cells. When you have type 2 diabetes, what happens is that your cells don't respond normally to insulin. So insulin is produced, but the receptors, and so your cells become less sensitive to it, and that means that the glucose can't get in. Either way, whether like type 1 diabetes, your pancreas stops producing insulin. With type 2, your body cells become resistant to it. Either way, the symptoms, the eventual symptoms are going to be the same, which is inability to control blood sugar and starvation of cells, because they're not going to get the glucose that they need. So large intestine, primary function is to absorb water, reabsorb water, and then that prevents dehydration. It's full of intestinal bacteria that produce vitamins that we can't make ourselves. So they're an integral part of our digestive tract, these bacteria. And as in that video in the very beginning of the lecture, they also actually produce enzymes that can help to break down certain carbohydrates that we can't break down. And then finally, they help to form and compact waste into feces that then are expelled through the anus. So the long intestine is shorter but thicker than the small intestine, and it has a protrusion off of it called the appendix, which people used to see as being unnecessary, but it turns out it's a reservoir of bacteria that can repopulate the colon after a diarrheal illness. So it actually does have a function. You have this would be the ileum of the small intestine. What we don't see here is the ileocecal valve, which allows material into the cecum, which is this sort of expanded area at the beginning of the colon. And we have the ascending colon, transverse colon, the descending colon, it's referred to as the sigmoid colon. You can't really see it here, but it curves down, around, and then back. Then you have the rectum, which leads to the anus, and the anal canal, or the anal canal, which leads to the actual anus. So defecation is a reflex that we acquire control of once the external anal sphincter matures. So in this cutaway, we've got the rectum with the anal canal, and there are two sphincters. There's an internal sphincter here, which is smooth muscle, and then there's the skeletal muscle sphincter. The internal anal sphincter responds to pressure by relaxing, as does the external anal sphincter, but because it's a skeletal muscle, we can acquire voluntary control over that. So not just defecating randomly and from place to place. And that turns out to be important in terms of as humans became during our evolutionary history, as we started to live in larger groups, it was important that there was a separate toileting area, and that people be able to not defecate willy-nilly because of infectious disease. So you can have diarrhea, which is the result of increased peristalsis. That's going to lead to not reabsorbing enough water, and so can lead to dehydration. It can happen because the nervous system is acting up, and or because there's an infection. Hemorrhoids, I would say, I used to show a video. Now I don't anymore because it is just terrible. Hemorrhoids are your propensity to get hemorrhoids in response to chronic constipation or diarrhea or being pregnant. And so having a lot of force, a lot of pressure on the lower rectum and the anus is genetic in the same way that your tendency to get varicose veins is. It's very similar. It's sort of a failure of the valves. And then, as we were talking about, irritable bowel syndrome. So inflammatory bowel disease used to be called sometimes ulcerative colitis, is a lot more serious because you can end up with sores that sort of move through all the layers of the colon and into the peritoneal cavity. And then diverticulosis, which is completely different. I just couldn't find a good picture of IBD, is when you have pockets that form in the wall of the colon. So essentially, the colon gets kind of stretched. And that can happen because of constipation. If you have bacteria that get trapped in there, right, even if they're the friendly kind of bacteria, they're reproducing every 15 minutes to half an hour, your population size quadruples in an hour, right? And it goes on from there. So you can end up with needing surgical removal in order to have healing. Okay. So this is going to show us a biopsy for colon cancer or colonoscopy. Which is really remarkable that we can do these things now. You know, that they can snake this tube in and with a camera and a light, and they can grab a little sample for testing in the lab to see if it's actually cancerous. They'll remove any polyps or outgrowths of the wall, because we know that although not all polyps become colon cancer, all colon cancer does come from polyps. So if you have a colonoscopy, they're going to take any polyps they find out. And that's that. So there's the journey of a boiga. And then this is just a summary slide with the major organs, right? And then this one is a summary of mechanical and chemical digestion. And that is that.